90 minutes. That is how close the United States and Canada came to a full-blown trade rupture before anyone hit pause. 90 minutes before a 50% tariff was set to slam into $20 billion of Canadian goods, Donald Trump posted a message on Truth Social announcing he was calling the whole thing off for now. 3 days. That is all the reprieve either side actually got. And within hours, Canada's own Prime Minister stood in front of cameras and refused to celebrate, warning that important work still remained. This is not the story of a trade war ending. This is the story of a trade war blinking, right at the exact moment the clock was supposed to run out. And nobody currently agrees on what happens next. If you want to understand exactly what fell apart, what got patched together at the last second, and why Canada is still refusing to fully bend even with a temporary deal supposedly in hand, stay with this one because the details here are moving fast and most coverage is only catching half the story. If breakdowns like this matter to you, hit subscribe right now because this situation is genuinely still unresolved and it is going to keep developing over the next several days. Every hour that passes without a signed document changes the calculus on both sides of the border. Let's go back to where this actually begins, because the deadline that almost detonated Tuesday night did not appear out of nowhere. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law so old and so rarely touched that its last confirmed use to actually impose a tariff dates back to 1949. Each proclamation targeted a specific named grievance. One went after Canadian provinces pulling American alcohol off government store shelves. One went after Canada's dairy tariff rate quota system, which the White House argued gave European cheese exporters better access than American ones. And one went after a Canadian surtax on American-made vehicles that didn't meet local compliance rules. Each proclamation carried the same penalty, an additional 50% duty stacked on top of whatever tariffs already existed, and crucially, none of it offered any protection for goods that were otherwise certified compliant under USMCA, the very trade agreement Trump himself signed during his first term. The number attached to all 3 proclamations combined came out to roughly $20 billion in annual Canadian imports, spanning everything from motor vehicles and wine to cement, plywood, and hockey sticks. According to the White House's own fact sheet, the administration framed this entirely as leveling the playing field for crucial American exports in cars, alcohol, and dairy. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer put out a statement the same day accusing Canada of continuing to retaliate against the United States, even as other trading partners negotiated in good faith, specifically citing the alcohol restrictions, the dairy quota disparity, and a cap Canada had placed on American vehicle exports. The proclamations came with a built-in countdown. By law, the tariffs could not take effect until 30 days after signing. That clock started July the 20th. It was set to expire at exactly 1 minute past midnight, Eastern Time, on August 19th, 2026. Now here's the part that made this legal maneuver genuinely different from anything the administration had used before, and it matters enormously for understanding why this specific tool was chosen. In February of 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court had already struck down the administration's broadest and most flexible tariff weapon, ruling that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act did not actually grant the president authority to impose sweeping unilateral tariffs the way it had been used. That ruling opened up an estimated $166 billion refund pool for importers who had already paid duties under the old framework, and it forced the White House to go searching for a legal replacement almost immediately. Section 301 of the Trade Act requires a formal USTR investigation before tariffs can be imposed, typically taking months. Section 232 requires a national security determination, also a lengthy process. Section 338 requires neither. The president can act by proclamation alone, no investigation, no hearing, no congressional vote required. That procedural bypass is exactly why, out of every tool available, this specific 96-year-old statute got dusted off and pointed at Canada. For weeks after the proclamations were signed, both sides publicly signaled they were negotiating, but privately, almost nothing moved. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette spent the weekend before the deadline in Washington meeting repeatedly with Greer. According to reporting from Bloomberg, the single biggest obstacle blocking a deal in those final 36 hours was not dairy and it was not alcohol. It was autos. Canada had pushed hard to bring the tariff rate on vehicles down to 10%, or alternatively, to expand an existing exemption that excludes American-sourced content from the tariff calculation entirely. The Trump administration held firm at a minimum 15% rate. That gap, 5 percentage points on paper, represented billions of dollars in real annual cost to an industry already operating on razor-thin margins. Quick pause here, because the auto industry's own numbers are worth sitting with for a second. And if this level of detail is useful, drop a like and subscribe. Because the next part covers exactly how close this actually came to blowing up completely. Because the stakes inside that specific dispute were not abstract. Flavio Volpe, president of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and a member of the federal government's own group of trade advisors, told CTV News directly that any negotiated tariff rate had to land below 6%, because that is roughly the profit margin the industry actually operates on. His exact words were that for 60 years, the auto sector had been working at 0% tariff exposure, and anything meaningfully above single digits risked pushing manufacturing investment out of Ontario entirely. That warning was not theoretical. General Motors had already closed its electric van plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, and scaled back jobs and production at its Oshawa pickup plant. Ford Motor Company had idled its Oakville factory back in 2024 and was only slowly ramping production of heavy-duty pickups after scrapping an earlier electric vehicle plan for that same site. Honda and Toyota, Canada's two largest automakers by production volume, hadn't made comparable cuts, but analysts pointed out that was largely because neither company had excess capacity sitting idle in the United States the way the Detroit Three did. Toyota had already announced expansion plans in Texas. Honda was reportedly considering a new North American plant that most analysts expected would land in the United States rather than Canada. Every one of these decisions, made months before the August deadline even arrived, was quietly reshaping where North American auto investment actually flows, tariff dispute or not. So with less than 36 hours on the clock, auto rules were the wall neither side could get past. And then, late Tuesday night, August 18th, with roughly 90 minutes left before the tariffs were legally set to activate, Trump posted on Truth Social. His exact words were that he had paused the 50% tariffs against Canada that were scheduled to kick in the following morning for a 3-day period, based on the fact that Canada and the United States, subject to the finalization of documents, had reached a deal. He added, almost as an aside, a reference to reviving the Keystone XL pipeline project, the one canceled years earlier, suggesting the broader agreement might extend into energy infrastructure as well. Within hours, Prime Minister Mark Carney posted his own statement confirming the postponement, but the tone could not have been more different from Trump's celebratory framing. Carney said substantial progress had been made, while cautioning that important work still needed to be done. That is not the language of a leader declaring victory. That is the language of someone buying time, while the actual substance of a deal remains genuinely unresolved. According to a White House declaration issued alongside the pause, the suspension was justified as being in the public interest because Canadian negotiators had, in the administration's words, expressed a commitment to concede on outstanding issues. Notice the wording there. Not that Canada had conceded, that Canada had expressed a commitment to consider conceding. Those are two very different legal and political positions. And the gap between them is exactly why this story is not actually over. Here's the detail that almost nobody outside trade law circles has fully processed yet. And it is arguably the single most important fact in this entire episode. As of this writing, no proclamation has been formally withdrawn or amended. The legal authority for the full 50% tariff still exists, sitting fully intact inside the Federal Register. It simply has not been applied to entries crossing the border during this 3-day window. That is a meaningfully different legal reality than a tariff being canceled. It is a tariff being held in reserve, ready to be activated the instant this temporary truce collapses, which means every business on both sides of the border that spent the past month scrambling to prepare for August 19th now has to keep preparing for a deadline that has simply moved, not disappeared, to the end of the day on Friday, August 21st. And this is where Canada's refusal to fully bow becomes the real story sitting underneath the headline. Because even as Trump framed this as a completed deal awaiting paperwork, the actual behavior coming out of Ottawa and out of the provinces told a very different story. Ontario has a documented history on exactly this kind of standoff, one that gives real context to how seriously Canada is treating even a supposedly finalized agreement. Back in March of 2025, when Trump doubled steel and aluminum tariffs in response to provincial pressure, Ontario Premier Doug Ford had already slapped a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, telling reporters at the time that Ontario didn't want this trade war but wouldn't back down until it was over, and that the province would use every tool available. That surcharge only came off the table after Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick personally offered what Ford himself called an olive branch, a direct meeting in Washington. Even then, Ford kept the surcharge option publicly on the table for months afterward, saying explicitly he wasn't ready to fully drop it until there were, in his words, zero tariffs on Canadian goods entering the United States. That is the posture Ontario has consistently held throughout this entire 18-month dispute, cooperative when there's genuine progress, but immediately ready to escalate again the moment talks stall. That same instinct is exactly what U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa flagged publicly just days before this latest deadline. Speaking during a visit to the Iowa State Fair alongside Ambassador Greer, Grassley said there was nothing wrong with Canada and the United States having tough negotiations, but he added a pointed warning that those negotiations could not be used as a way of destroying CUSMA, the broader trilateral trade agreement governing commerce across all of North America. That warning matters because it reveals something important happening on the American side of this dispute too. Not every Republican in Washington is fully aligned with the administration's approach here. Grassley represents a state whose agricultural exporters depend heavily on stable, predictable access to the Canadian market, and his comments suggest real unease inside Trump's own party about how far this specific confrontation should be allowed to go. There's also a wildfire smoke dimension to this dispute that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage. But it's worth understanding because it illustrates just how broad and unpredictable the underlying tension between these two governments had become even before the tariff deadline arrived. Earlier in the summer of 2026, drifting smoke from Canadian wildfires settled over parts of the United States, and Trump publicly floated the idea of tariff pressure tied specifically to air quality complaints. A threat that never became a formal proclamation, but added yet another layer of friction to an already strained relationship. Trump administration officials have also repeatedly pointed out, in justifying the broader tariff pressure campaign, that Canada and China were the only two major trading partners that chose to retaliate against earlier American tariffs rather than simply negotiate quietly the way most other countries did. That framing matters because it positions Canada, in the White House's own telling, as an outlier choosing confrontation, while Canada's own government has consistently framed its actions as proportionate, necessary responses to tariffs it never asked for in the first place. Let's also look closely at exactly what sits inside that $20 billion annex, because the sheer breadth of it explains why so many different industries suddenly found themselves paying close attention to a dispute most Americans assumed was limited to cars and cheese. The published summaries of the Motor Vehicle Proclamation alone describe an annex reaching well beyond vehicles themselves into agricultural and food products, leather goods, plywood, textiles, metals, industrial machinery, and printed circuit boards. That breadth was not an accident of careless drafting. It reflects how these tariff annexes actually get built, by pulling entire chapters and headings out of the harmonized tariff schedule, rather than targeting individual products one at a time based on their specific connection to the underlying dispute. The Dairy Proclamation carried its own detailed grievance, alleging that Canada's tariff rate quota structure under USMCA denies retailers the ability to obtain and use quota quantities the way the equivalent quota under Canada's separate agreement with the European Union does, a technical distinction buried in trade law that nonetheless became one of the three formal justifications for a 50% duty. The Motor Vehicle Proclamation, meanwhile, explicitly cited a documented 22% drop in Canadian purchases of American vehicles, falling from $9 billion to $20, $3 billion over the year, ending in March 2026, alongside data showing Canadian buyers had shifted roughly to $85 billion in purchasing toward Mexican, Japanese, Korean, and German automakers instead, with Mexico alone capturing almost $2 billion of that shift. Washington read those numbers as proof of Canadian discrimination against American exporters. Ottawa read the exact same numbers as evidence that Canadian consumers were simply responding rationally to earlier American tariffs by buying from someone else, precisely the kind of market behavior any economist would expect once prices shift. Now here's the part of this story that actually determines what happens next, because a 3-day pause is not a resolution, it's a countdown restarted with slightly better optics. What exactly needs to happen between now and the end of Day Friday for this deal to actually hold? According to reporting on the outline of the agreement, the emerging framework covers market access commitments, economic security provisions, and digital trade rules, alongside the specific auto tariff compromise both sides have been fighting over for weeks. But outline is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Outlines are not signed documents. Outlines are not legally binding text sitting in the Federal Register. Every trade lawyer who has spent the past several weeks studying Section 338's legal foundation understands this distinction clearly, because the same procedural simplicity that let Trump impose this tariff with a single proclamation also means it can be reactivated with the same speed the moment this temporary truce breaks down. And legal challenges to Section 338 itself have not gone away just because the tariffs got paused. Multiple trade law firms, including Holland and Knight, have been tracking anticipated litigation in the U.S. Court of International Trade, regardless of how these specific negotiations resolve, because the underlying legal questions remain completely unanswered. Does Section 338 remain valid law, or was it effectively superseded by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, both of which created more modern, more procedurally rigorous frameworks for addressing exactly this kind of trade discrimination claim? Does the president need an affirmative finding from the International Trade Commission before acting under this statute, the way he would under most other tariff authorities? Historian and former State Department official Philip Zelikow has argued publicly that Congress effectively repealed Section 338 through implication when it overhauled American trade law decades ago, since those newer statutes, in his words, cover the whole subject that Section 338 used to address. Yale law professor Jed Rubenfeld has taken the opposite position, arguing the statute remains fully in force regardless of what came afterward. Nobody currently knows which interpretation a federal court would actually adopt, because Section 338 has simply never been tested this way before in the modern era. Even if Friday's deadline produces a signed, finalized agreement, that underlying legal uncertainty doesn't disappear. It just becomes less urgent for a little while. There's also the built-in escalation clause buried inside Section 338 itself that almost nobody outside trade law circles has fully absorbed yet. Under Section 338B, if the administration determines that Canada is maintaining or increasing the discrimination the tariffs were originally meant to address, the president holds the authority to escalate further, up to and including a complete import ban, not just a higher tariff rate. That clause is precisely why Canada's negotiators have approached even this temporary reprieve so cautiously. Publicly declaring victory before the actual documents are signed and finalized would hand the American side exactly the kind of political cover needed to claim Canada backed down, without Canada having secured anything legally enforceable in return. Carney's own history reinforces just how deliberately cautious this posture has been throughout the entire dispute. Earlier in the standoff, Carney had specifically said Canada merely matched an existing American auto tariff and stopped well short of full retaliation, a restraint that some provincial leaders, Doug Ford chief among them, had publicly pushed back against, arguing Ottawa needed to respond with more force. That internal pressure between Ottawa's calculated caution and provincial leaders demanding harder pushback appears to be part of exactly what forced both governments back to the negotiating table with real urgency in these final days. Here's a number worth sitting with because it puts the entire scale of this confrontation into sharper perspective than the dramatic headlines usually allow. Even at the full 50% rate, covering the complete $20 billion annex, independent analysis suggests these tariffs would only touch roughly 5% of the total goods Canada exports to the United States in a given year. That is not nothing. 5% of a trading relationship worth hundreds of billions of dollars translates into billions in real disrupted commerce. But it also means the macroeconomic shockwaves from this specific dispute, while genuinely painful for the auto sector, the alcohol industry, and dairy producers caught directly in its path, were never going to single-handedly collapse the broader Canada-US trading relationship the way some of the more alarmist coverage implied. What this dispute actually reveals is something narrower and, in some ways, more important, a live demonstration of exactly how fragile and improvisational modern American trade policy has become in the months following the Supreme Court's IEEPA ruling. A 96-year-old statute, revived because it offered the fastest legal pathway available, used to threaten a close ally and treaty partner, then pulled back from the brink with 90 minutes to spare, based on an outline rather than a signed agreement. Zoom out for a moment and consider what this pattern actually signals to every other country currently negotiating with Washington. Section 338 has now been tested in real conditions. It survived its first 30-day window without being struck down by a court, even though it never actually got applied to a single shipment before being paused. That distinction matters enormously for how this tool gets used going forward. Any government negotiating with the United States over the next several years now has to factor in the real possibility that a similarly obscure, similarly dormant legal authority could be revived against them with comparable speed, and that even a last-minute reprieve doesn't mean the underlying threat has been retired. It means the threat has been holstered, fully loaded, ready to be drawn again the moment talks stall. So what does Canada actually gain by refusing to fully bow in these final negotiations, even with a tentative deal reportedly on the table? The answer lies in exactly the caution Carney displayed in his own public statement. By declining to declare victory prematurely, by insisting there is still important work to be done, rather than celebrating a finished agreement, Ottawa preserves its ability to walk away from terms that don't actually solve the underlying auto tariff dispute, the one Flavio Volpe warned could push manufacturing investment permanently south of the border if the final number lands anywhere near the administration's 15% floor. That posture is not weakness. It's the same disciplined, methodical approach Canada's negotiating team has maintained throughout this entire 18-month standoff, refusing to let a ticking clock force acceptance of terms that damage the country's industrial base for a generation, just to avoid a few days of uncomfortable uncertainty. There's a broader financial angle to this standoff worth understanding too, because markets do not wait politely for Friday's deadline to resolve itself before repricing risk. Currency traders and commodity desks have spent the past month treating every headline out of Washington and Ottawa as a signal. And the whiplash between Tuesday night's celebratory Truth Social post and Carney's far more guarded statement the following morning produced exactly the kind of mixed signal professional investors hate most. A tariff that might or might not return in 72 hours is genuinely harder to price than a tariff that definitely takes effect on a known date, because it forces every affected company to hedge against two entirely different futures simultaneously. Auto parts suppliers with cross-border inventory have to decide whether to accelerate shipments before Friday, just in case the deal collapses. Exactly the kind of costly, inefficient behavior that a stable, predictable trading relationship is supposed to prevent in the first place. Dairy cooperatives and alcohol distributors face the same dilemma, forced to plan simultaneously for a world where the tariff snaps back at full strength and a world where it quietly fades into a footnote once the paperwork gets signed. That dual-track uncertainty is itself an economic cost, one that never shows up cleanly in any single data release, but accumulates steadily across thousands of individual business decisions made under exactly the kind of ambiguity this 3-day pause created rather than resolved. The question hanging over the next 72 hours is genuinely simple to state and genuinely difficult to answer. Does the outline that averted a midnight deadline actually translate into signed, legally binding text before Friday's new deadline arrives? Does the auto tariff gap between Canada's push for single digits and Washington's floor of 15% actually close? Or does it get papered over with vague language that both sides interpret differently the moment implementation questions arise? Does Congress, watching senators like Grassley voice open concern about CUSMA's survival, apply enough pressure to push this toward a more durable resolution? Or does the entire cycle simply repeat itself in 3 days, with a new round of 11th hour brinkmanship? History inside this specific relationship suggests brinkmanship is not an aberration here. It is the operating pattern. Deadlines get set, deadlines get extended, surcharges get threatened, surcharges get suspended, and both governments circle back to the table again and again without ever fully resolving the structural tension driving all of it. There's also a useful historical yardstick for measuring just how unusual this specific week has been, even by the standards of an 18-month trade dispute that has already produced more deadline theater than most trade relationships see in a decade. Back in February of 2025, the very first round of tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods was itself delayed by a full month after a single phone call between Trump and Justin Trudeau, Carney's predecessor, with Canada agreeing to border security commitments in exchange for breathing room. That pattern repeated again in March, when tariffs on some Canadian goods were pushed back a second time until early April, following direct pushback from American business leaders warning the trade war was rattling financial markets. Compare that earlier cadence, delays measured in weeks, sometimes a full month at a time, to this week's reprieve, measured in a single 3-day window. The shrinking size of each successive pause tells its own story about how much slack has been squeezed out of this relationship since the dispute first began. 18 months ago, both governments had room to grant each other a month to cool down. Now, with Section 338 sitting fully loaded in reserve and an escalation clause capable of triggering a full import ban, neither side appears willing to extend more than a long weekend's worth of trust at a time. There's also the wider USMCA review, sitting patiently in the background of all of this, a slower-moving but arguably more consequential process than even this week's dramatic 90-minute reprieve. The formal review began on July 1st, 2026, as required by the terms of the agreement itself, and the United States has already declined to extend the pact in its current form for a full 16 more years, the option that would have provided the most stability for exactly the kind of integrated auto and agricultural supply chains caught in the middle of this specific tariff fight. Instead, all 3 countries are now inside an open-ended renegotiation window with no fixed conclusion date, one analysts have warned could stretch for years without full resolution. That agreement currently shields somewhere around 90% of Canada's total exports from the kind of broad USMCA blind tariffs. Section 338 just demonstrated the president can impose with a single signature. Whatever happens with this specific 3-day pause, however Friday's deadline resolves itself, that much larger structural negotiation over the future of the entire North American trading system continues running in parallel, almost entirely disconnected from the week-to-week drama playing out over auto tariff percentage points. It is entirely possible for this narrower Section 338 dispute to reach a stable resolution, while the broader question of whether USMCA survives in anything resembling its current form remains completely unanswered for months or even years to come. What makes tracking this genuinely worthwhile over the next few days is that the outcome will reveal something about the durability of this entire framework, not just this one tariff. If Friday produces a real signed agreement that actually closes the gap between Canada's push for a single-digit auto rate and Washington's insistence on a 15% floor, that becomes a template for how future disputes under Section 338 get resolved quietly through negotiation before the legal authority ever actually gets applied to a single shipment. If instead, Friday arrives with the outline still unfinished and the tariffs snap back into force at full strength, that becomes an equally important template. Proof that even a presidential Truth Social post celebrating a deal doesn't guarantee one actually materializes in time. Either way, the businesses caught in the middle of this, the auto parts suppliers, the dairy cooperatives, the distillers, the furniture makers, have already learned the most important lesson of this entire episode. Nothing about this relationship right now can be taken for granted more than 72 hours in advance. That is the real headline sitting underneath Tuesday night's dramatic pause, not that a crisis was averted, but that certainty itself has become the scarcest resource in North American trade. What makes this particular moment worth watching closely isn't really the specific outcome of Friday's new deadline, whatever that turns out to be. It's what the entire sequence reveals about how fragile trade certainty has become for two economies that have spent nearly 4 decades building an integrated manufacturing and agricultural relationship worth close to $1 trillion annually. A tariff that can be imposed by proclamation alone can also be paused by proclamation alone, with no formal legal process attached to either action. That kind of unilateral flexibility might look like efficiency from inside the White House. From inside a Windsor auto plant, or an Ontario dairy cooperative, or a Kentucky distillery that spent years building shelf space in Canadian liquor stores, it looks like whiplash. Planning horizons collapse to a matter of days, capital investment decisions frozen indefinitely, and workers on both sides of the border left waiting to find out whether Friday brings a durable resolution or simply another headline about another pause. If this breakdown helps you actually understand what happened behind Tuesday night's dramatic last-minute reprieve, take a second to hit subscribe, because this situation is still genuinely unresolved, and there is a real chance this entire cycle repeats itself before the week is even over. Drop a comment and let me know whether you think this tentative deal actually holds through Friday, or whether the auto tariff gap between Ottawa and Washington is simply too wide to close in 72 hours. And if you know someone whose job touches the auto sector, the dairy industry, or cross-border trade in any way, send this their way. Because the difference between a 6% tariff and a 15% tariff on a razor-thin manufacturing margin is not an abstract policy debate for them. It's the difference between a plant staying open in Ontario or quietly relocating south. This is not a finished story. This is a pause, legally reversible at any moment, sitting on top of a dispute that has already run for a year and a half with no permanent resolution in sight. And the next 72 hours will determine whether that pattern finally breaks or whether it simply resets the clock one more time.